Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Hotel lobbies are meant to feel safe. Brightly lit, open spaces where people check in and out without a second thought. But when the crowd thins out and the night deepens, strange things tend to pass through unnoticed. I had been working the night shift at the Argonne Hotel in Denver for over 4 years when something occurred that would remain with me long after I left that job. The Argonne was not an upscale property, but it was respectable enough. A mid-range business-class hotel just outside the downtown area that catered mostly to corporate guests and travelers passing through on layovers. The kind of place with reliable conference rooms, complimentary breakfasts, and quiet, carpeted halls that always smelled faintly like a mix of lemons and old HVAC systems. I liked the monotony of the night shift. Things rarely happened after midnight aside from the occasional late arrival. And the silence in the lobby felt like something I could depend on. Most nights were uneventful, and I had grown comfortable with the rhythm of routine. It was in late October when the incident began. The date stays with me because the hotel had just finished putting up its seasonal decorations. Artificial orange and red leaves taped to the front desk, a plastic pumpkin wedged between 2 vases in the lobby. That night had been particularly slow. The guest list was light, the halls were quiet, and I had just finished reviewing the day's ledger and was beginning the night audit. It was shortly after 2 in the morning when I heard the soft, mechanical hum of the front doors sliding open. A man walked into the lobby alone. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, maybe a few years older, and wore a tailored charcoal gray business suit with a faint pinstripe. A neatly knotted navy blue tie was tucked into a crisp white shirt, and in his right hand he carried a dark leather briefcase. His shoes were clean and polished, and his pace was calm and measured, as though he was entirely familiar with his surroundings. He approached the front desk without hesitation and stopped directly in front of me. In a clear and even tone, he told me that he had a reservation under the name Rosen. The name didn't ring any bells, but I entered it into the system without question. Nothing came up. I tried alternate spellings and scanned both previous and upcoming dates in case the reservation had been shifted or entered incorrectly. Still, no results appeared. I asked him if he had a confirmation number or some form of identification so I could look up the reservation manually. He didn't reach for a wallet or produce any paperwork. He remained standing exactly as he was and simply looked at me with a faint smile that never moved to his eyes. There was no frustration in his expression, no confusion or impatience. His eyes remained fixed on mine in a way that made the silence around us feel suddenly much heavier than it had a moment before. Something about his expression unsettled me, not in an obvious or dramatic way, but in a quiet, deeply rooted one. He seemed calm, far too calm, and his gaze lacked any warmth or recognition. It was as if he had spent so long waiting for something that he no longer expected to find it. His face held no particular emotion, and it became increasingly difficult to tell whether he was truly listening to anything I said or simply standing there for some other purpose entirely. Without saying another word, he turned away from the counter and began walking across the lobby toward the elevators. He didn't stop to ask for a key card. He didn't gesture or glance back to see if I was watching. As he approached the elevator, the doors slid open automatically, even though no one had called it and no key card had been scanned. He stepped inside with the same deliberate pace he had walked in with, and the doors closed behind him without delay. I stood frozen behind the desk for several seconds, unsure whether what I had just witnessed had actually happened the way I believed it had. I picked up the desk phone and called Tony, the night security officer who worked out of the lower-level office. I told him that a man in a suit had just entered the elevator and asked him to check the guest floors. Tony radioed back a few minutes later to tell me the elevator had already returned to the ground floor, doors wide open, completely empty. He said he hadn't seen anyone in the halls, and no room doors had opened or closed during his sweep. We reviewed the security feed from the lobby camera together. The video showed the elevator arriving. The doors opened and then closed again. No one was visible on the feed. There was no sign of the man I had just spoken to. He wasn't captured at the front desk. He wasn't captured walking across the lobby. There was simply nothing between the moment the elevator arrived and the moment it departed again. That should have been the end of it, or at least the most unusual part. But the following night, around the same time, shortly after 2 a.m, the lights in the lobby flickered suddenly. It wasn't a gentle dim or the kind of soft glitch you expect in older buildings. It was sharp, abrupt, and jarring, like the power had momentarily dropped and then returned without warning. At that exact moment, the elevator descended to the ground floor. The doors opened. No one was inside. I stood behind the desk staring at the empty elevator car for what felt like an unreasonably long time. It happened again the next night, and the one after that. Always just after 2 o'clock. Always the same sudden flicker in the lobby lights, followed by the elevator arriving on its own, an opening to reveal an empty interior. There was never a sound of footsteps, never any indication that someone had entered or exited. I checked the system logs for elevator activity and found nothing that would explain it. The system recorded no button presses, no keycard use, and no authorized calls to that elevator during those hours. Maintenance was called in to inspect the wiring and the elevator control software. They found no faults. Everything was functioning properly. Yet the elevator continued its pattern, responding to nothing, moving on its own. The final piece came from a guest. One morning, just after 6, a woman came to the desk to check out. Her eyes were tired and her voice was flat, like she hadn't slept properly. As I printed her receipt, she asked if it was standard policy to have more than one staff member working the desk at night. I told her that it wasn't. I had been alone the entire shift. She seemed surprised. Then, in a quiet and hesitant voice, she told me that she had come down around 2 a.m. to ask for towels. When the elevator opened, she stepped into the lobby and saw a man standing behind the front desk. He was wearing a dark business suit and holding a briefcase at his side. According to her, he stood completely still, watching her, with both hands resting lightly on the counter. She assumed he worked there, but when she called out to him, he didn't respond. She turned slightly, reached into her pocket to retrieve her key card, and when she looked back toward the desk, the man was gone. I hadn't left the desk at any point that night. I had been sitting in my chair with the audit logs open the entire time, and I would have seen someone walk behind me. I reviewed the security footage immediately. Just like before, the video glitched during that exact window of time. The timestamp froze. Then the image cut forward by several minutes. No man was visible. No movement was recorded. I reported everything again to our general manager, who had mostly ignored my previous concerns. But now that a guest had provided a similar report, he began to take it seriously. He asked one of our administrative assistants to look through older hotel records to see if the name Rosen had ever come up. 2 days later, she found a set of old physical logs in storage and brought them to the office. The name appeared several times in conference booking documents from the early 1990s. Harold Rosen had worked as a regional director for a financial services company that used to rent out space in the hotel for training events and executive retreats. In the spring of 1991, he had stayed in room 932 during a 5-day conference. On the final day of his stay, he had been let go from the company. He never checked out. Housekeeping found him deceased in the room the next morning. The report from that time listed the cause as a prescription overdose. There was no suicide note. After the incident, the company ceased booking events with our hotel, and the room was eventually taken out of use. Years later, during a renovation, it was converted into a storage space. Room 932 no longer existed on our reservation system, yet occasionally the system still listed the room as occupied, with no guest attached to the status. I never saw the man again after that first night. But on certain nights, always near the end of October, always around 2 in the morning, the elevator would still descend on its own. The lights in the lobby would flicker for no clear reason, and the elevator doors would open slowly and without sound, revealing nothing but the empty car beyond. I never walked toward it when that happened. I would simply remain behind the desk, staring at the opening doors, with the feeling that someone unseen was watching from within the elevator car, standing silently just out of view. I worked the night shift at the Beauregard Hotel in New Orleans during 2002. It stood near the edge of the French Quarter, nestled among the wrought iron balconies and cracked sidewalks, like something from another century trying to keep pace with the present. The building had been around since the 1890s and wore its age proudly. Most guests were drawn to its faded elegance and antique charm, but those of us who worked there knew the building had moods. Its corridors always echoed more than they should have. The lighting was soft, but somehow never warm. And at night, the hotel didn't feel empty, even when no one was around. The structure had a long history. Over the years, it had changed hands multiple times and taken on different identities. Before it became a hotel, it had served as a private boarding house and, if the older records were accurate, briefly operated as a brothel during the early 20th century. Guests liked to ask about the rumors, expecting ghost stories and scandal. We mostly deflected, sticking to the official version printed in brochures. But within the staff, especially among those who worked overnight, there were stories we didn't put in writing. The first incident happened in January. I remember it clearly because it was the first time I felt genuinely uneasy inside the building. Around 2:30 in the morning, I received a call from a guest staying on the second floor. He sounded calm, but his tone carried hesitation, as if he wasn't sure he should be bothering anyone. He said he had just heard something unusual coming from the lobby. According to him, it sounded like a woman crying. Soft, distant, not loud enough to be distressing, but persistent enough to keep him awake. I stepped away from the front desk and walked toward the open area beyond the hallway. The chandeliers overhead were dim to their overnight setting, casting the marble floors in a muted amber glow. I looked around for any sign of someone seated near the elevators or the stairwell, but there was no one there. The air felt strangely cool, and I thought I caught a faint trace of perfume, but it faded almost as soon as I noticed it. A few nights later, another call came in at nearly the exact same time. This time, a woman on the 3rd floor said she had looked out over the mezzanine and seen someone standing in the lobby. She described a woman in a long dress, standing very still, facing the elevator. I walked the entire ground floor that night, checked the security footage, and found nothing unusual. At least, not at first. It wasn't until I reviewed the camera feed frame by frame that I noticed something strange. Just before 3 o'clock, there was a flicker in the lower left corner of the lobby feed. At first, I thought it was a lens flare or a fault in the playback. But the distortion had shape to it. It wasn't sharp, and it didn't resemble a person exactly. But there was a vertical movement to it, almost like a figure caught just outside of focus. It drifted through the space near the elevator and vanished seconds later. I checked the same camera angle from other nights and saw nothing like it. Then, 2 nights later, it happened again. The same time, the same vague, shifting blur, captured near the elevator just before the clock hit 3. I didn't tell anyone. It was too unclear, too easily dismissed. I thought I might have been imagining patterns or simply seeing what I expected to see after hearing stories from guests. Then, near the end of that month, a guest staying in room 212 had an experience that changed the way I thought about everything happening inside that building. He had arrived earlier that afternoon and checked in without incident. He kept mostly to himself, spent time walking around the quarter, and returned to the hotel carrying a paper bag of books he had picked up at one of the shops along Royal Street. He wasn't the type of guest who attracted attention. Polite, quiet, and neat. Just before 3 a.m., he came back down to the front desk. He didn't say much right away, but his expression had changed since earlier that evening. His face looked pale and drawn, and his posture was tense in a way that suggested discomfort. He stood near the desk for a while, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, scanning the lobby as if trying to reassure himself that nothing else was about to happen. He had taken a short walk outside to clear his head, and when he returned, he entered through the main doors and found the lobby empty. Or so he had thought at first. As he crossed the marble floor, he noticed a figure standing near the base of the grand staircase. It was a woman wearing a red dress, the kind of formal gown that looked out of place in the quiet stillness of the lobby. Her back was to him, and she didn't move. She stood completely still, her arms at her sides, her head tilted slightly downward. At first, he assumed she was a guest returning from some kind of formal event, although the stillness of her posture unsettled him. He walked a few more steps toward the elevator, and that was when he heard a sound. It wasn't a full voice, not even a complete word, just the suggestion of whispering, faint and incomplete, like someone speaking behind a closed door or from the bottom of a stairwell. When he turned to look at her, she was no longer facing away. She had turned toward him. He said her eyes looked dark and hollow, as though the shadows beneath them were too deep for her face. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and her expression remained fixed and emotionless. Her mouth moved slightly, but he couldn't hear anything. Before he could react, she stepped to the side and disappeared behind one of the marble columns near the elevator. He waited for a few seconds, expecting her to reappear. When she didn't, he approached the column. There was no one there. The space behind it was too narrow to conceal a person, and there were no side doors or exits within reach. After he returned to his room, I reviewed the camera footage. At precisely 3:01 a.m., he appeared on the lobby feed. He walked through the main entrance, paused briefly near the staircase, then turned and backed away. I could see his expression change as he stood still for several seconds. He took another step backward and eventually moved toward the front desk, where he remained out of frame. But nowhere in the footage did the camera capture the figure he had described. The area near the staircase remained visibly empty throughout the recording. The only movement came from him. By the end of that week, the story had made its way through the hotel staff. Housekeepers began swapping shifts to avoid cleaning the second and third floors alone during the night. Several of them said they heard someone walking across the lobby floor after hours, measured footsteps that echoed across the tile, even when the room was completely empty. One employee claimed she passed a mirror on the second floor and saw a flash of red in the reflection, but no one walking beside her. A few days later, the night custodian turned in his keys without collecting his last paycheck. He had worked at the Beauregard for over a decade. Before leaving, he told one of the bellhops that he had seen a woman in a red dress walk through the lounge near the top of the stairs. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge him at all. But she had no reflection in the large mirror on the far wall. The image in the glass remained unchanged, even as she moved directly in front of it. I started researching the hotel's history during the slower shifts. Public records confirmed that the building had been used for various purposes over the years. In a newspaper clipping from 1904, I found mention of a woman named Lenora DeVoe. She had been employed at the establishment when it operated as a gentleman's residence, a polite term for a brothel during that time period. According to the article, Lenora died after falling from one of the upper balconies following an altercation with a client. The incident had been ruled accidental, but rumors suggested something more violent. A later mention described her final performance as a singer in the lounge, where she wore a striking red satin gown. After learning that, I began to associate the appearance in the lobby with Lenora, although I never said her name aloud during my shifts. The disturbances continued intermittently throughout the following months. Guests would occasionally report hearing footsteps in the early hours. Some said they heard a woman whispering names, though none could repeat what they heard with any certainty. One man said he saw someone watching him through the elevator glass, standing perfectly still just outside the doors. When the elevator opened, no one was there. I never saw her with my own eyes. But there were nights when the elevator would arrive at the lobby without being called. The doors would open and remain that way for several seconds before closing again. There were nights when I could smell faint traces of perfume near the front desk. Old-fashioned, floral, and thick in a way modern perfumes rarely are. And once, when the hotel was nearly empty during off-season renovations, I heard the unmistakable click of high heels on marble, echoing through the lobby, though I was the only person on shift. I left the Beauregard Hotel the following spring. I never asked to keep a copy of the footage, though I knew the management had archived it. It remained locked away in the office computer, labeled by date and time, but no one spoke of it publicly. The hotel continued to operate as usual. Guests continued to check in, unaware of what might be standing quietly beneath the staircase in the early hours of the morning. And the night staff, those who had been there long enough to hear the stories or see the footage, never lingered near the lobby elevators after 2:30. There were no official explanations, no final answers, just the recordings, the stories, and that lingering feeling. An unseen presence in a red dress returning again and again to the place where her life had ended, standing silently in the same shadowed space while the city slept around her. I arrived in Tokyo on a damp, overcast evening in late October of 2018. After more than 10 hours in the air and an unexpected delay at Narita, the city felt like a blur of lights and movement that I was drifting through rather than actually entering. The hotel I had booked was a towering structure in Shinjuku, a high-rise wrapped in tinted glass and smooth concrete, perched above the neon glow of the streets like something untouched by time. It was marketed as a luxury experience, the kind of place that emphasized silence, symmetry, and efficiency. I remember stepping through the automated doors and into the lobby, where the air smelled faintly of citrus and lacquer, and where every surface gleamed as though the space had only just been unwrapped. The lobby was vast and mostly empty by the time I checked in. The only sound came from a soft instrumental track playing overhead, one of those ambient jazz loops that barely register unless you're already on edge. The floors were made of polished marble, pale and flawless, and the front desk stretched across the far wall in a broad curve of black glass and brushed steel. A single staff member, dressed in a dark suit with immaculate posture, processed my check-in with quiet efficiency, handing me a key card without much more than a nod. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. Everything about the interaction felt streamlined and distant, as if both of us had agreed not to linger in the moment longer than necessary. Once I had the key in hand, I moved across the lobby toward the elevators, my suitcase rolling behind me in near silence. There were no other guests in sight, no footsteps echoing across the marble, no signs of anyone coming or going. As I approached the elevator bay, I pressed the button and stood waiting in the long, glossy stretch of stillness that had settled around me. Behind the front desk, spanning the entire back wall, was a pane of dark-tinted glass. It wasn't a mirror, exactly, but it was reflective enough to catch light and vague shapes, just clear enough to suggest movement if something passed by. My gaze drifted there without intention. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just tired and letting my eyes settle wherever they landed. That's when I saw her. There was a woman standing directly behind me. Her image was unmistakable in the reflection, slightly distorted by the tint, but clear enough that I could see she was positioned a few feet behind me, facing the same direction I was. She was tall, dressed in a long white garment that clung to her arms and hung awkwardly from her shoulders, as though the fabric had once been wet and never fully dried. Her hair was dark and appeared matted, hanging around her face in uneven strands. Her skin, even in the distorted glass, looked pale to the point of grayness. And though I couldn't make out every detail of her face, I could tell she wasn't blinking or shifting her weight. She stood perfectly still. My first instinct was to turn around. I did so immediately, expecting to see someone standing behind me. Perhaps another guest had approached quietly, or maybe a staff member had entered the lobby without my noticing. But the space behind me was completely empty. There was no one within sight. The front desk was unoccupied again, and the entire lobby remained as silent as it had been moments earlier. I scanned the area slowly, searching for any sign of movement or sound, but there was nothing. Not a voice, not a footstep, not even the sound of a door closing somewhere nearby. When I turned back toward the glass, she was still there. Her reflection had not changed position. She remained standing behind me, exactly as she had been before, with the same rigid posture and blank expression. The woman in the reflection looked close enough that I should have been able to hear her breathing or feel the warmth of another body near mine. But there was nothing. It felt as if the room had shifted subtly, like the air had thickened without explanation. I remember the sensation creeping across my skin, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the temperature, but from a sharp awareness that something is terribly wrong. I didn't turn around again. Whatever was or wasn't behind me was no longer something I could confront physically. My eyes remained locked on the glass, where her reflection continued to stand in silence. There was no movement in her arms, no shift in her head, no sign of breathing. Her presence in the reflection felt independent from the reality around me, as if she existed within the glass rather than on either side of it. The elevator arrived with a muted chime, and I stepped inside as soon as the doors opened. I didn't look back as they closed behind me. I kept my eyes fixed on the control panel, focusing on the numbers as they lit up one by one. I avoided looking at the polished elevator walls. I avoided checking to see if she had followed me. In my room, I locked the door immediately and secured the latch. I slid the heavy desk chair in front of the handle, not because I believed it would stop anyone from entering, but because the ritual made me feel slightly more in control. I didn't open the curtains, even though the window view was likely beautiful. I didn't look in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth. I slept with the lights on and the television playing static white noise. Even then, I hardly slept. I kept waking every hour, half convinced I had heard something move in the room with me. The next morning, I made my way downstairs just after 7. The lobby was brighter, and with daylight seeping through the tall windows, it looked less like a museum and more like a functioning space. But even in the daylight, I noticed that the black glass wall behind the front desk had lost its clarity. Where the surface had once been sharply reflective, it had now appeared smudged and faintly matte, as though someone had deliberately dulled its finish. I remember wondering if it had always looked like that, and whether the clarity I saw the night before had been exaggerated by the lighting, or by something else entirely. Later that day, while I was returning to my room, I shared an elevator with a member of the cleaning staff. She looked tired and moved slowly, dragging a cart behind her. As we stood together in silence, I heard her mention, without context or prompting, that she no longer worked overnight shifts. Her voice was low, almost muttered. She said she had once seen a woman standing behind her in the glass wall near the concierge station. Not in the room, only in the reflection. The figure had looked almost like a guest, but her face had been faintly smiling, and her eyes had been entirely black, with no whites or color. There had been no noise, no change in temperature, just the overwhelming sense that she had been watched too closely by something that wasn't supposed to be watching. She didn't speak any further after that. She didn't explain why she told me. She just stepped out on her floor and continued down the hallway with her cart. Before checking out the next morning, I passed the front desk one last time. No one was there at that hour. I paused for only a second, staring at the black glass. The surface had been dimmed again, perhaps by intentional neglect, perhaps by something else entirely. It still reflected, but not cleanly. Not enough to see a face clearly, and certainly not enough to see what might be standing behind you. I haven't returned to that hotel since. I don't seek out places with polished black surfaces anymore. I avoid mirrors when I'm alone in unfamiliar rooms. And when I find myself walking through a silent lobby late at night, I keep my eyes straight ahead and never glance at the reflections that follow beside me. I started working the night shift at the Regency Garden Inn in Atlanta during the winter of 2017. It was one of those mid-range hotels situated near the downtown edge. Close enough to be convenient for travelers, but far enough out that it never quite felt connected to the city. I had taken the job because the hours worked with my school schedule, and the pay was just enough to get by. My shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and for the most part, it was uneventful. Most nights, I sat behind the desk, monitoring the lobby cameras, checking in the occasional late arrival, and restocking the complimentary coffee station around 4 in the morning. The building itself was functional but uninspired. Beige walls, scuffed baseboards, and old framed art that never got dusted. The second floor in particular had a strange atmosphere. The lighting always seemed slightly dimmer up there, even though the bulbs had been replaced more than once. The hallway carpets carried a faint smell of mildew, and the air felt heavier the farther you walked from the elevator. The first incident happened on a Thursday night, early in March. At around 2 in the morning, I received a call through the hotel switchboard. The man on the line said he was calling from room 209. His tone was controlled but uneasy. He explained that he had been hearing loud banging noises from the room next to his. He described the banging as slow, deliberate, and forceful. Something heavy striking the wall at regular intervals. He also mentioned strange static on his television that started as soon as he had turned it on. What unsettled me most was his final complaint. He said he could hear breathing through the wall. It didn't sound like air conditioning or plumbing. He said it was close, human, and drawn out, as if someone were standing still, pressing their face against the other side of the wall, exhaling directly into the sheetrock. After the call ended, I pulled up the guest information system to check room 209. The room had been marked out of service for over a week. I remembered the report from maintenance. There had been a minor plumbing issue involving a leak behind the bathroom wall. The repair crew had removed the bed frame, carpet padding, and some furniture. After the work was completed, the room had not yet been cleaned or prepared for guests, so it remained unlisted in the booking system. According to our records, no one had stayed in that room since the last maintenance visit. There had been no check-ins, and the room's keycard reader had been deactivated. At the time, I assumed the caller had made a mistake. It wasn't unheard of for guests to mix up their room numbers, especially when tired. I made a note of the complaint and moved on. Then, roughly 45 minutes later, the same voice called again. This time, his tone was more tense. He repeated everything he had said earlier, the banging, the static, the breathing, but added something more unsettling. He said the wall itself felt like it was pulsing. He claimed that as he sat in bed, he could feel a subtle but continuous pressure coming from the wall behind the headboard. He described it not as vibration, but as movement, as if the wall was expanding and contracting in slow waves, as if something on the other side was shifting rhythmically against the drywall. The complaint didn't align with anything logical. Room 209 was unoccupied and sealed. The room next to it, 207, was occupied by a single woman who had checked in earlier that evening. There were no active maintenance operations on that floor, and I hadn't received any other calls. Still, the hotel's policy required that any recurring disturbance be investigated. I called Carl, the night security guard, and asked him to take a look. Carl had worked security at the hotel for years. He was quiet, methodical, and difficult to rattle. That night, he took the elevator to the second floor and walked down the hallway toward room 209. I watched him through the security feed. The hallway appeared completely still, with no signs of movement, and the lights outside 209 remained steady. He stood in front of the door for a few seconds before using his master keycard to unlock it. The hallway light spilled into the room, revealing a mostly empty space. The bed frame had been removed and leaned against the far wall. There were no curtains, no bedding, and no furniture other than a dresser missing its drawers. The carpet was coated in a thick layer of dust, which reflected the light unevenly. Carl stepped inside, briefly out of view from the camera. He later told me that the dust had been undisturbed, not just around the entrance, but across the entire floor. There were no footprints visible. Even after stepping inside, his own shoes left no noticeable impression at first, as though the dust had settled over something not quite solid. After about 30 seconds, I heard a sharp burst of static from the walkie-talkie on the front desk. The volume had not been high, but the noise was sharp enough to cut through the quiet of the lobby. Following the static, there was a voice. It was soft, hoarse, and strained. The words were clear and slow. The voice said, "Please, make it stop." Then the channel went silent again. Carl didn't respond immediately. When he finally came back downstairs, he said very little. He didn't explain what he felt or heard in that room. He just returned to his station and remained there for the rest of the night. I noticed that he didn't go back to the second floor at any point during his shift. After he left in the morning, I went through the phone logs. I searched for any record of incoming or outgoing calls from room 209. There were none. According to the system, no calls had been made or received from that room in over 2 weeks. I double-checked the maintenance records. The phone in room 209 had been disconnected during the plumbing repair. The jack had been removed from the wall and was no longer wired into the main system. Even if someone had tried to plug in a phone, the line would have been completely dead. I asked the maintenance team to inspect the room again the following morning. They confirmed everything Carl had said. The furniture had not been returned. The dust on the floor was still thick, and there were no signs of any recent disturbance. The phone line was inactive. The electronic lock log showed no activity other than Carl's keycard entry during the incident. Later that day, I reviewed the surveillance footage from the hallway outside room 209. The recording showed Carl arriving, unlocking the door, and entering the room. No other movement occurred on that floor during the hours surrounding the incident. There were no unexplained shadows, no flickering lights, and no motion in the footage. However, there was a brief anomaly in the audio. Just before Carl reached the door, there was a sudden change in the ambient noise, an audible dip followed by a short burst of static, similar to what I had heard through the walkie-talkie. If you listened carefully, underneath the hum of the air conditioning system, there was something else. Faint and fleeting, but distinct. It sounded like breathing. The incident was never escalated to management beyond a short note in the daily log. No formal report was filed, and corporate was not contacted. The general manager didn't want anything unexplained attached to the building. A week later, the room number was changed. Room 209 became room 211. The numbering on the rest of the floor was shifted accordingly, and the maintenance staff reactivated the keycard reader and phone line. The room was cleaned thoroughly and returned to service. Despite that, the employees avoided assigning that room unless every other option had been exhausted. Housekeeping staff were reluctant to enter it alone. One housekeeper claimed that while vacuuming near the far wall, she had heard what sounded like a whisper, quiet and disjointed, but unmistakably human. She couldn't make out the words, but it had come from the corner near the bathroom. After that shift, she refused to clean that room again. I left the hotel a few months later, but the memory of that night remained with me. I had never believed in hauntings or unexplained phenomena, but I had answered a call from a room with no working phone line. I had heard a man's voice speak clearly through a closed radio frequency, and I had seen the untouched dust across the floor of a room that should have been sealed. Since then, I've stayed in plenty of hotels, but I always request rooms on higher floors, away from empty wings and out-of-service areas. I no longer sleep soundly when there is a wall behind the headboard that connects to a vacant space, because I now understand that some rooms might be empty on paper, but not entirely unoccupied.